If you're like I used to be, you probably don't even think twice about grabbing a little pack of fresh rosemary or thyme at the grocery store. It's just a couple of dollars, right? But then you do it again next week. And the week after that, before you know it, you've spent 60, 80, maybe even over $100 in a single year, just on herbs you could have grown yourself. 3 years ago, I was doing exactly that. I'd buy fresh herbs almost every time I went shopping because I wanted that bright, fresh flavor in my cooking. But every time I tried growing them in pots on my patio, they'd either die in the winter or I'd have to start all over again the next spring. It felt like I was stuck in this endless cycle of buying and replanting. And here's what really bothered me. I knew there were perennial herbs out there, plants that could come back year after year, but nobody was really talking about how to grow them successfully in containers, especially if you live somewhere with cold winters. Most advice was either for big garden beds or for people who could bring everything inside. I didn't have that kind of space or energy, so I started doing my own research. I wanted to find herbs that could actually live in pots for multiple years, not just survive, but keep producing. And I wanted to know exactly what it would take to keep them alive through winter without losing them. That's when I discovered there are quite a few perennial herbs that do really well in containers if you choose the right ones and set them up properly. I'm not talking about miracle plants that require zero work. I'm talking about realistic options that, once established, can give you fresh herbs for 4, 5, even 6 years from the same plant. In this video, I'm going to share the 15 perennial herbs I've found work best in pots. Some of them you probably already know, like rosemary and thyme. Others might surprise you. I'll show you which ones are the easiest to start with, how to set up your pots so the plants actually last, and most importantly, how to protect them through winter so you're not starting from scratch every spring. But before we get into the specific herbs, I want to be honest with you about something. Growing perennial herbs in pots isn't completely hands-off. You still need to choose the right container, the right soil, and you have to understand what these plants need during the cold months. If you skip those steps, you'll probably end up disappointed just like I did in the beginning. The good news is, once you get the foundation right, the payoff is huge. You stop buying little plastic packs every week. You stop replanting every spring, and you end up with plants that actually get better with age. So if you're tired of spending money on herbs that don't last, or if you've tried growing them in pots and watched them die off every winter, stick around. I'm going to walk you through exactly what I wish I had known 3 years ago, the herbs that are actually worth planting once, and the real steps to keep them going for years. Let's start with the first group of herbs that are almost impossible to kill in a pot if you give them half a chance. Now that you understand why I stopped buying fresh herbs every week, let's get into the good stuff, the actual plants. I'm going to start with 8 perennial herbs that are genuinely easy to grow in pots and have a high chance of surviving for multiple years. The first one on my list is rosemary. This is probably the most popular perennial herb for containers, and for good reason. Rosemary is incredibly drought tolerant once established, loves full sun, and can live for many years in the same pot. I have one plant that's been in the same container for over 4 years now. Just make sure you use a pot with excellent drainage, at least 12 to 14 inches deep, because rosemary hates wet feet. Harvest the sprigs regularly, and it will stay bushy and productive. Next is thyme, specifically English thyme. There are many varieties, but English thyme is the most reliable for cooking and for containers. It's a low-growing plant that doesn't mind being a little crowded in a pot. Thyme actually prefers slightly porous soil, so you don't need to feed it much. One thing I love about thyme is how it trails over the edge of the pot, making it look beautiful even when you're not harvesting. Creeping thyme is another great option if you want something that spills over the sides. Sage is another classic that does very well in pots. It has beautiful grey-green leaves and a strong flavour that works great with chicken and pork. Sage likes full sun and well-draining soil. The only thing to watch with sage is that it can get woody after a few years. When that happens, you can either prune it hard in spring or divide the plant, which I'll talk about later in the video. Greek oregano is one of my favourites for containers. It has a much stronger flavour than regular oregano and stays more compact, which makes it perfect for pots. Like rosemary and thyme, it loves heat and sun. I grow mine in a terracotta pot that gets baked in the afternoon sun, and it thrives. Just be careful not to overwater it. Oregano is very forgiving of neglect, but hates sitting in wet soil. Now, let's talk about chives and garlic chives. Both of these are incredibly easy and come back reliably every year. Chives have that classic mild onion flavor, while garlic chives have a light garlic taste and flat leaves. They don't need deep pots, even 8 to 10 inches is enough. They also produce pretty purple or white flowers that are edible. One of the best things about chives is that you can cut them down to the ground and they'll grow back quickly. I harvest from the same plants multiple times a season. Lemon balm is a bit different from the others I've mentioned so far. It has a bright, lemony scent and flavor that's wonderful in tea and desserts. It grows fast and can get quite large, so give it a bigger pot if you can at least 14 inches. Lemon balm is very forgiving and will grow in partial shade, which is nice if you don't have full sun all day. Just know that it can self-seed aggressively, so if you don't want it everywhere, cut the flowers before they go to seed. Finally, I have to mention mint, but with a big warning. Mint is perennial and grows like crazy, but it is invasive. If you plant it in the ground, it will take over your garden. That's why I only grow mint in pots. I keep spearmint and peppermint in their own containers, and I never let them touch the soil. As long as you keep them contained, mint is one of the easiest and most productive herbs you can grow. It loves water and can handle a bit of shade. These 8 herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, chives, garlic chives, lemon balm, and mint are the ones I recommend starting with if you're new to growing perennial herbs in containers. They're forgiving, productive, and most of them can handle a wide range of conditions. In the next chapter, I'm going to share 7 more perennial herbs that are a little more unique or have special requirements, but are still very much worth growing in pots. Some of them you might not have considered before. If the first 8 herbs felt a little safe, this chapter is where things get a bit more interesting. I'm going to share 7 more perennial herbs that are absolutely worth growing in pots, even though they might require a little more attention or have some special characteristics. Let's start with French tarragon. This is the one with that distinct anise or licorice flavor that's essential for classic French cooking. The thing about French tarragon is that it doesn't grow well from seed, so you almost always have to buy a plant. It also prefers cooler weather and can struggle in very hot summers. But if you give it afternoon shade in hot climates and keep the soil from drying out completely, it will reward you with incredible flavor. I grow mine in a slightly larger pot, so the roots stay cooler. Winter savory is another underrated herb that deserves more attention. It has a peppery, thyme-like flavor and is incredibly hardy. Unlike summer savory, which is an annual, winter savory comes back every year. It stays relatively small and compact, so it's perfect for containers. It also handles drought quite well once established. I like to keep a pot of it near the kitchen door because it's one of those herbs you reach for when you want to add depth to soups and stews. Sweet marjoram is often confused with oregano, but it has a milder, sweeter flavor with floral notes. It's a little more tender than Greek oregano, so in colder zones, you'll want to give it some winter protection or bring it inside. In containers, it grows into a lovely bushy shape. I use marjoram in Mediterranean dishes and also in tea blends. It's one of those herbs that makes everything taste a little more special. Now we come to bay laurel. This is a tree in its natural habitat, but it grows surprisingly well in large containers for many years. The leaves are essential for soups, stews, and sauces. The big thing to know about bay is that it is not very cold hardy. If you live in zone 7 or colder, you will need to bring the pot inside or into a protected space during winter. I keep mine in a large pot on wheels, so I can move it into the garage when temperatures drop. It's a bit more work, but having fresh bay leaves year-round is worth it for many cooks. Anise hyssop is one of my favorite bonus herbs. It has a sweet, licorice flavor and produces beautiful purple flower spikes that pollinators love. It's very easy to grow in containers and can handle both sun and partial shade. Anise hyssop is also a short-lived perennial, meaning it may only last 3 to 4 years, but it self-seeds readily, so you'll usually have new plants coming up. I grow it more for the bees and butterflies than for cooking, but the leaves do make a nice tea. Bee balm, also known as monarda, is another pollinator favorite that can work in larger containers. Look for shorter varieties if you're growing in pots, because some types can get quite tall and floppy. It has a minty, citrusy flavor and produces striking red, pink, or purple flowers. Like anise hyssop, it's great for attracting beneficial insects to your patio or balcony. Just make sure it has good airflow to prevent powdery mildew. Finally, I want to mention pineapple sage. This is a fun herb that smells exactly like fresh pineapple when you rub the leaves. It produces bright red flowers in late summer and fall that hummingbirds go crazy for. Pineapple sage is technically a tender perennial, so in colder zones you'll treat it more like an annual or bring it inside for winter. But in zones 8 and above, it can live for several years in a large pot. I grow it mainly for the scent and the flowers, though the leaves can be used in drinks and desserts. These 7 herbs bring more variety in flavor and purpose to your container garden. Some of them, like bay laurel and French tarragon, require a little more planning around winter protection. Others, like anise hyssop and bee balm, give you the added benefit of supporting pollinators. In the next chapter, I'm going to shift focus from the plants themselves to how to set up your pots properly from the very beginning, because even the best herbs will struggle if the container and soil aren't right. Up to this point, I've talked a lot about which perennial herbs work well in containers. But here's the truth that a lot of people miss. Even the best herbs will struggle or die if you don't set up the container correctly from the beginning. The way you choose your pot, mix your soil, and manage water and nutrients has a huge impact on how long these plants will actually live. Let's start with the pot itself. For most perennial herbs, bigger is generally better, at least when it comes to depth. I recommend pots that are at least 12 inches deep for smaller herbs like thyme and chives, and 14 to 18 inches deep for larger plants like rosemary, sage, and lemon balm. The extra soil volume gives the roots room to grow and helps buffer against temperature swings. Terracotta pots are popular because they breathe and dry out faster, which helps prevent root rot. But they also dry out quicker in hot weather, so you'll need to water more often. Plastic and glazed ceramic pots hold moisture longer, which can be helpful in hot, dry climates. Fabric pots are another great option because they promote air pruning of the roots and excellent drainage. No matter what material you choose, drainage is non-negotiable. Every pot must have drainage holes. If water can't escape, the roots will sit in soggy soil and eventually rot. I've lost more plants to overwatering than to any other single cause, especially in the first year. When it comes to soil, never use straight garden soil in containers. It's too heavy, compacts easily, and doesn't drain well. Instead, use a high-quality potting mix as your base. I like to amend it with about 20 to 30% perlite or pumice for extra drainage, and a bit of compost for nutrients. Some people add a small amount of worm castings or slow-release organic fertilizer at planting time. The goal is a light, fluffy mix that water can move through easily, but still holds enough moisture for the roots. Watering perennial herbs in pots is different from watering annuals. These plants generally prefer to dry out a bit between waterings. A good rule of thumb is to water deeply when the top inch of soil feels dry. In the heat of summer, you might need to water every 2 or 3 days. In cooler spring and fall weather, you can often go longer. The key is to water thoroughly so the entire root ball gets moisture, then let it dry out again. Shallow, frequent watering encourages weak, shallow roots. Feeding is another area where people often go wrong. Perennial herbs don't need a lot of fertilizer. In fact, too much nitrogen will make them grow lots of soft, weak foliage that's more susceptible to pests and has less flavor. I feed my container herbs lightly 2 or 3 times during the growing season, with compost tea or a diluted organic liquid fertilizer. In early spring, I also top dress with a bit of compost or worm castings. That's usually enough to keep them healthy and productive for years. Sunlight is critical for almost all of these herbs. Most of the ones I've recommended need at least 6 hours of direct sun per day. Rosemary, thyme, oregano, and sage especially love heat and sun. If you're growing on a balcony or patio that only gets morning sun, you might want to focus more on mint, lemon balm, and chives, which can handle a bit more shade. One final setup tip. Think about arrangement. You can grow several compatible herbs together in one large pot, but be careful with aggressive growers like mint. I prefer to keep mint in its own container so it doesn't crowd out everything else. Grouping herbs with similar water needs together also makes care much easier. If you take the time to choose a good-sized pot with proper drainage, use a well-draining soil mix. Water deeply, but not too often. And give your herbs enough sun. You've already solved most of the problems that cause people to give up on container herb gardening. But there's still one major challenge that determines whether your perennial herbs will actually survive for many years. And that's getting them through winter. In the next chapter, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to overwinter your container herbs, especially if you live in a colder climate. If there's one chapter in this video that will determine whether your perennial herb garden succeeds or fails over multiple years, this is it. Overwintering container herbs is the part that trips up most people, including me, when I first started. Here's the reality. Growing perennial herbs in the ground is much easier in winter because the soil insulates the roots. In a pot, the roots are exposed to much colder temperatures from all sides. A pot can freeze solid, and that can kill even hardy plants. That's why proper winter protection for container herbs is non-negotiable if you want them to come back year after year. Not all perennial herbs need the same level of protection. Some are surprisingly tough in containers. Rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, chives, and winter savory can often survive winter in pots with minimal help, especially in zones 6 and warmer. They may go dormant and look dead, but the roots stay alive. Lemon balm, marjoram, and anise hyssop are a bit more sensitive and usually benefit from extra protection. Then there are the herbs that almost always need help in colder climates. Bay laurel, French tarragon, and pineapple sage are not reliably hardy in containers below zone 8. Bee balm can be hit or miss depending on the variety and how cold your winters get. These plants usually need to be moved to a protected location or brought indoors. So, what actually works for overwintering herbs in pots? The simplest method is heavy mulching combined with smart placement. In late fall, after the first hard frost, I add 3 to 4 inches of mulch, shredded leaves, straw, or pine needles on top of the soil in each pot. This helps insulate the roots. Then I group all my pots together against a south-facing wall of the house. The wall radiates heat and blocks cold wind. I also put the most tender plants in the center of the group, with the hardier ones on the outside. If your winters are very cold, zone 5 and below, or if you have especially tender herbs, you may need to go further. Some people move their pots into an unheated garage, shed, or cold frame. The goal is to keep the plants cold enough to stay dormant, but protected from extreme temperature swings and drying winds. If you use this method, check the soil every few weeks. You probably won't need to water much at all during winter, maybe once or twice the entire season, because the plants are not actively growing. For the most tender plants, like bay laurel and pineapple sage, many people bring them inside for the winter. If you have a bright, cool room around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, that's ideal. Avoid putting them in a warm living room near a heater, because they'll try to grow when they should be resting. I keep my bay in the garage near a window where it gets some light but stays cool. One mistake I made in my first year was overwatering during winter. I thought the plants needed water because the air was dry. Instead, I kept the soil too wet and lost several plants to root rot. In winter, less is more when it comes to water. Only water if the soil is completely dry and the plant shows signs of wilting. Another common mistake is waiting too long to provide protection. Once the ground freezes or you get a hard freeze, it's often too late. I try to have everything set up by mid to late November, depending on where I live. The payoff for doing this right is huge. The rosemary plant I mentioned earlier that's been in the same pot for over 4 years has survived multiple winters with this method. Every spring it comes back strong, and I get to harvest from it all season long without replanting. Overwintering does take some planning, and a little extra work in the fall. But it's what separates people who have a few herbs for one season from those who have productive container herb gardens that last for years. Once your herbs make it through winter, the next step to keeping them healthy and productive long term is dividing them when they get too crowded. That's what we'll cover in the next chapter. One of the best things about growing perennial herbs in pots is that you can actually multiply them and keep your plants healthier at the same time. This process is called dividing, and it's one of the most useful skills you can learn if you want your container herb garden to last for many years. Here's why dividing matters. After a few years in the same pot, most perennial herbs become root-bound. The roots fill up all the available space, circle around the inside of the pot, and the plant starts to struggle. It may produce fewer leaves, look less vigorous, or even start to die back in the center. Dividing solves this problem by giving the plant fresh soil and more room to grow. At the same time, you get new plants for free that you can pot up or give away. The best time to divide most perennial herbs is in early spring, just as new growth is starting, but before the plant puts a lot of energy into flowering. This gives the divisions the whole growing season to establish themselves. Some people also divide in early fall, but spring is generally safer, especially for beginners. Not all herbs are divided the same way. Clumping herbs like chives, garlic chives, lemon balm, anise hyssop, and bee balm are the easiest. You can simply dig up the whole plant, gently pull or cut the clump into smaller sections, each with some roots and shoots, and replant them. I like to use a sharp knife or garden spade for this. Each new division should be about the size of a small plant you'd buy at a nursery. Woody herbs like rosemary, sage, thyme, and oregano are a bit more delicate to divide because they don't like their roots being disturbed too much. With these, I often prefer to take cuttings instead of dividing the whole plant, especially if the plant is still relatively young and healthy. However, if a woody herb has become very large and woody in the center, you can carefully divide it in spring, making sure each section has both roots and some green growth. It may take a season or two for the divisions to look full again, but they usually recover. Mint is one of the easiest herbs to divide. Because it spreads by runners, you can often just pull up sections that have rooted and pot them up separately. This is also a good way to control mint if it's starting to take over its container. When you're potting up divisions, use fresh potting mix and make sure the new pots have good drainage. Water the divisions well after planting and keep them in a slightly shaded spot for the first few days to a week while they recover from the shock of being moved. After that, you can gradually move them back into full sun and care for them normally. The benefits of dividing go beyond just getting free plants. Regularly dividing your herbs keeps the mother plant healthier and more productive for longer. It also prevents the plant from becoming so root-bound that it declines or dies. I've seen rosemary plants that were divided every 3 or 4 years stay vigorous and productive for over a decade in containers. If you're just starting out, you don't need to divide everything at once. Start with the easy clumping herbs like chives and lemon balm. Once you get comfortable with the process, you can try dividing or taking cuttings from your woody herbs. Dividing is one of those simple tasks that makes a big difference in how long your container herb garden lasts. It turns a one-time investment into a garden that keeps giving for many years. In the next chapter, I'm going to talk about the common mistakes I see people make with perennial herbs in pots and how to avoid them, along with some real numbers on how much money you can actually save by growing this way. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about the mistakes I see most often with perennial herbs in containers, and then I'll show you some real numbers on what you can actually save by growing this way. The number one mistake is overwatering. People water their pots on a schedule instead of checking the soil. In containers, especially with well-draining mixes, it's easy to keep the soil too wet. This leads to root rot, which is the fastest way to kill perennial herbs. Always check the top inch of soil before watering. The second mistake is using pots that are too small. Many people start with cute little pots because they look nice, but small pots dry out fast, restrict root growth, and make it much harder for plants to survive winter. For most of the herbs we've discussed, go bigger than you think you need. Third, using the wrong soil. Garden soil or cheap potting mix that doesn't drain well is a common problem. Heavy soil stays wet too long and compacts over time. Invest in a good quality potting mix and add perlite if needed. Fourth, skipping winter protection. I've said it before, but it's worth repeating. Perennial herbs in pots need help getting through winter in most parts of the country. Mulch, group pots together, move them to a sheltered spot, or bring tender ones inside. Without this step, you'll likely lose plants every year. Fifth, never dividing or rejuvenating the plants. After 3 or 4 years, even hardy herbs can become root-bound and decline. Dividing or taking cuttings keeps them vigorous and gives you more plants. Sixth, over-fertilizing. Many people think more fertilizer means more growth. With herbs, too much nitrogen often results in weak, floppy growth with less flavor. Light feeding a few times a year is usually enough. Now, let's talk about the money, because this is where the real benefit shows up. Let's say you currently spend about $10 a week on fresh herbs from the grocery store. That's roughly $40 a month, or close to $500 a year. Even if you're more conservative and only spend $15 to $20 a month, you're still looking at $180 to $240 annually. Now, compare that to setting up a container herb garden. Let's say you invest in 10 good perennial herb plants, some quality pots, potting mix, and a bit of mulch and fertilizer. A realistic first-year investment might be between $200 and $350, depending on how many pots you buy and whether you already have some containers. After the first year, your ongoing costs drop dramatically. You might spend $30 to $50 a year on soil amendments, occasional new pots, and maybe replacing 1 or 2 plants. Over 3 years, your total investment could be around $300 to $450. Meanwhile, if you had kept buying herbs at the store, you might have spent $500 to $700 in that same 3-year period. That's a meaningful difference, and it doesn't even count the satisfaction of walking outside and cutting fresh herbs whenever you need them. The longer your plants live, the better the math gets. A rosemary or thyme plant that lasts 5 or 6 years in a pot pays for itself many times over. Of course, these numbers will be different for everyone depending on how much you currently spend and how you set up your garden. But the principle is the same. Investing once in good plants and proper containers saves money and effort over time. In the final chapter, I'm going to share my honest advice on what I would do if I were starting this journey again today, plus some simple steps to get going. If I was starting this journey again today, knowing what I know now, there are a few things I would do differently, and a few things I would keep exactly the same. First, I would start smaller. When I began, I tried to grow too many different herbs at once. I ended up overwhelmed and didn't give each plant the attention it deserved. If I were starting over, I would begin with just 4 or 5 reliable, high-use herbs: rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, and chives. These 5 alone would cover most of what I cook with, and they're all relatively easy to keep alive in pots. Second, I would invest in better pots from the beginning. I started with whatever cheap containers I could find, and many of them didn't drain well or were too small. The money I saved up front cost me plants later. Good pots with proper drainage are worth the investment if you want these herbs to last. Third, I would take winter protection more seriously from year 1. I lost too many plants in the first couple of winters because I didn't prepare them properly. Now I treat overwintering as a non-negotiable part of the process, and my survival rate is much higher. What I would keep the same is my focus on perennials instead of replanting every year. That single decision has saved me time, money, and frustration. I would also keep dividing my plants and giving extras to friends and neighbors. It's one of the most satisfying parts of growing this way. If you're watching this and feeling inspired to start, here's what I recommend. Pick 2 or 3 herbs from the list we discussed that you actually use in your cooking. Get good-sized pots with drainage, use a well-draining soil mix, and place them where they'll get enough sun. Focus on getting those plants established in the first season. Next year, you can add more. Don't expect perfection right away. Some plants will thrive immediately, others might take a season or 2 to settle in. There will be mistakes. I still make them. But each year, you learn a little more, and your garden becomes more productive with less effort. The biggest shift for me wasn't just having fresh herbs available. It was no longer feeling like I was constantly starting over. There's something deeply satisfying about walking out to the same pots year after year and still being able to harvest. If you're tired of buying little packs of herbs that go bad in the fridge, or if you've tried growing them and felt discouraged when they didn't come back, I hope this video gave you a clearer path forward. Perennial herbs in pots are not magic, but they are realistic and very much worth the effort. If this video was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find this kind of practical gardening information. And if you have questions about specific herbs or your climate zone, leave a comment below. I read as many as I can. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Now go plant something that will keep giving back for years.